In old school MapleStory, before Starforce, spell trays, flames and cubes were a thing, we had scrolls. Back then, scrolls were the only way a player was able to upgrade their equipment, and they played a huge role in a player's progression. A well-scrolled equipment is the difference maker between a pro and a noob, and in the case of Dex's Warrior, it is an absolute necessity to provide the dex and accuracy required for them to hit monsters and to progress in the game. As such, there's a huge market for scrolls, and it was always in high demand. The newer and more broke players would be farming these scrolls to sell them for money to buy potions and new equipments to progress, while players in a later game with more accumulated wealth will be mass buying these scrolls in an attempt to better the endgame equipment they already own. It was truly a beautiful self-sustaining economy where it allowed for both new and veterans to progress at the same time. This is possible since many of the highly sought after scrolls were also dropped by lower level monsters, making it low entry even for new players. The only two factors stopping scrolls from overflowing the market is the high consumption rate and the insanely low drop rate. It was possible to be farming for hours upon hours to get just one scroll drop, if you're lucky. Which is why it is a lot more common for players to be surprised by a random scroll dropped while exploring or leveling, instead of hunting scrolls exclusively. Enough about that, let's talk about how a scroll works. Most equipments in MapleStory have a property known as number of upgrades available, which is more commonly referred to as upgrade slots. The number of upgrade slots denotes the number of scrolls that can be used on the equipment, with the number decreasing every time you throw a scroll on it, even if the scroll fails. And yes, the scroll you sold your kidney for could fail, making your equipment absolutely useless. Because not only your scroll is gone, your equipment is now left with one less upgrade slot, limiting the maximum potential of it, and is now worth lesser than what it used to be. And the success rate of the said scroll that you are gambling your life savings on is determined by its color. 100% success for blue, 60% for brown, and 10% for yellow. And if you're not familiar with the scrolling system of MapleStory, you might think, since 10% is a lot harder to succeed, the trade-off must be that it is very common and cheap, while 100% scrolls are a lot more rare and expensive. And to create a god weapon, you just have to save up tons of money for the 100% scrolls for a guaranteed success. And while that seems like a logical system, you have to remember, MapleStory is a gambling simulator. It is never that easy around here. In reality, the 10%, 60 and 100% scrolls all gives different stats each, with the 10% scroll giving the most stats, 60% giving a moderate stats, and 100% giving close to nothing. So you see the problem here. If you want a god weapon, the best there is, you got to not only buy the insanely expensive 10% scrolls, but you also better start praying that you somehow, by some miracle, pass all 7 of those scrolls in a row. Which to the people that understands probability, that has a chance of 0.00001% of happening, which even to MapleStory standards isn't really a good odds. Which is why most people settle for the more balanced option of 60% scrolls. The scroll itself does not give more stats than a 10% scroll, but if you consider its success rate, on average, a fully scrolled 60% equipment will have more stats than its 10% and even 100% counterparts. And passing 7 60% scrolls in a row has a way better odds of 2.8%, which is not that great, but it is still 280,000 times way more probable than the 10% scrolls. So to most people, it just makes more sense to use 60% scrolls on default unless you are mega rich. But to people that are risk takers, they might go for the dark variants of those scrolls, which actually gives the same stats as 60% and 10% scrolls respectively, with a slightly better success chance. But there's the slight caveat that if the scroll fails, there is a 50% chance of the item to be destroyed. In other words, it's just like, it's gone, just boom, goes your equipment, money, scrolls, and your will to live, I guess. But that does bring the probability up by a lot. From a 2.7% of the 60% scroll to 8.2% with the 70% variance, and the 10% 0.0001% to 0.02% for the 30% variance. Which admittedly is a lot, but most of the time your items kinda don't really survive that far. So most people do stick to the regular 60% and 10% scrolls for the more economical value. Since even if the scroll doesn't do well, at least you will still have your equipment and you don't have to go around begging and being homeless or like naked or something, I don't know. Now, like most things in the game, there is a tech or meta to it. Same goes for scrolling. There are many techniques players do to ensure that they have the best odds possible when scrolling an item. That may include going to a specific channel, their favorite map, or sitting on their most expensive chair. However, most will agree that those are just superstitions and doesn't really work. But there is one method that a lot of players use and is supported by probability and math. And that legendary method is dummy scrolling. The idea behind dummy scrolling is simple. Let's say you have a coin. The odds of you flipping heads 10 times in a row is pretty rare. And it will be calculated like this. And using the same logic, it is unlikely for a scroll to keep failing. For our case, let's use a 60% scroll. For a 60% scroll to fail one time, it has a 40% chance. But for it to fail twice in a row, it has a chance of 16% now. But for it to fail 3 times in a row, the probability of that happening will be 6.4%. So as you can see, a longer streak of failures has a lower probability of occurring. And it is this idea that dummy scrollers is aiming to exploit. For example, let's say the dummy scroller is trying to scroll a work glove for gloves for attack 60% scrolls. What they would typically do is gather a bunch of useless equipments along with some useless 60% scrolls. And they will start by throwing the useless scrolls on the useless equipments first, with the intention of failing those scrolls, just to stack the failures up. So let's say the useless scroll have failed twice in a row now. And the probability for a 60% scroll to fail 3 times in a row is 6.4%, which is very unlikely. So they would then throw the real gloves for attack 60% scroll on the work glove they were intending to scroll. And since the probability to fail 3 times in a row is 6.4%, the probability of it passing is basically 93.6%, giving a huge boost from the 60% scroll. And ladies and gentlemen, that is known as gambler's fallacy. Even though everything seems logical, in reality, that is not correct at all. While there isn't anything wrong with the calculations mathematically, there is a lot wrong with the understanding of what the numbers meant. Because yes, the chance of the 60% scroll failing 3 times in a row is indeed only 6.4%. That is mathematically correct. But the 6.4% is not the chance of the next scroll to fail after the initial 2 failures. What it does is describe the probability of those exact sequence of failure happening. Then you might be wondering, what does the 93.6% mean then? It's actually the probability to not fail 3 times in a row. In other words, it also includes situations where either the first or the second scroll, or maybe even both, is a success. So it is not just talking about the chance after the first 2 failures. But logically, why? It seems logical that the more you fail, the lower the chance of that happening. So why is it that failing more scrolls does not make the next scroll a higher chance to succeed? Well, that's because every scroll you throw on an equipment is an independent event, meaning the success or failure of one scroll does not affect the success or failure of the scroll afterwards. So if you use a 60% scroll, the chance of you succeeding will always be 60%, regardless if you have passed 1, 2, or even 100 scrolls prior to it. A more intuitive way to visualize this is, funny enough, through understanding how the code is implemented. I won't get too technical. Just imagine each time you use a 60% scroll, you roll a fair 10-sided D10 dice. And if the dice lands on a number 6 or lower, the scroll passes. But if it's 7 or higher, the scrolls fail. So basically, a 60% chance. Simple. So you use a scroll and the dice rolls to a 4. The scroll passes. And now you throw another scroll, meaning you will throw another dice. And the probability of the dice getting a 6 or lower is still the same 60%. Because the dice itself has no memory of what number it just rolled previously. It is an independent event by itself. It simply does not care about what just happened. It just has one job, and it is to give you a random number from 1 to 10. And let's say the dice rolled a 4 this time. The scroll passes again. Congrats! You got 2 60% scroll passes in a row. I will then describe the probability of that sequence to happen to be 36%. So thinking that dummy scrolling will boost your probability at all is a pretty fatal fallacy. Because not only it doesn't work, it also makes you waste more money to buy useless equipment and scrolls, just to quote-unquote burn your bad luck away. Which is just not how the world works or how the scrolls are programmed and designed. So the next time you catch yourself thinking that the fail streak has to end eventually, right? Just remember, yes, it will end eventually. But the chance for the streak to end each time is still 60%.